student outcomes in online courses tend to lag behind those in offline courses. This is something we've seen time and time again. But why? Studies show that a large part of this has to do with the fact that actively and visibly engaging with students in the online setting is maybe even more important than in the offline one, and it can be quite a challenge, as we know. Whether or not students engage affects the engagement of other students, and to make your students want to engage, you as the instructor have to create that sort of environment that welcomes the engagement. This starts with your personality and also what we call your online presence or online identity. Even in an offline setting, we know that an instructor or a teacher presence is important. Surely you can remember teachers of yours that were favorites in the past because they had a bit of a personality, or they connected with you and the other students, or they had a really distinct teaching style. Well, it's not really any different online. An online teaching presence actually begins before the course even commences, when the teacher is acting as an instructional designer, when they're planning and preparing the course for their students. And then it continues throughout the course as the instructor facilitates the discourse and provides direct instruction when required. One particular source calls a teacher presence the binding element in cultivating a learning community. Whew, pretty important. Tutors who are new to online education often ask how they can establish this online identity that is as close to face-to-face setting as possible. So in this video, we want to equip you with some strategies on how you can create your personal online identity. We'll go through a few of the tips and then hear from some of our current tutorial instructors at Chiron about how they've worked to establish their online presence and kind of what challenges they've had and how they've overcome those. This is not an exhaustive list, especially as you have to find out what works best for you. But let's get you started with some strategies. One useful way to think about developing your instructor presence is to think about it in three distinct categories. The first is your persona. So this is your personality, your interests, what makes you you, your distinct style, teaching and as an individual. All of these characteristics will affect the impression that the students have of you and consequently their engagement. The second is your social presence. So the connections that instructors make with students and those that the students are making with each other are really key in order to build a learning community. And the third is an instructional presence, the role the instructor plays in guiding students through the learning process, which can be personalized for each student in the online setting. Now let's get on to some specific strategies and ideas, focusing specifically on the synchronous format or the live teaching format that we use at Chiron. The use of personalized language in these examples can also really help you establish an emotional connection. At Chiron, we help you as the instructor take these first few steps by explaining who you are to the students, getting your photo and your bio ahead of time, and making sure that students have some of this information before they even sign up for the tutorial. Another thing you could do right at the start of your course is send out a welcome email or a welcome message in your virtual classroom, depending on what you're using. This email represents the first point of contact that you're making to your students, and it can really break the ice. Ideally, it should consist of a short description of yourself, maybe a rough course outline, and an outlook of the course. One of the tips that we give our instructors is not to overload students with information in these cases. Our students tend to be language learners still at Chiron. English is not their first language. They have different educational backgrounds. So we want to make our texts and our messaging to our students as accessible as possible. And we also try to make it a little informal and fun so that they're more eager to log in. And don't underestimate the importance of language choice. For instance, try to write your messages in the second person instead of the third person. So for instance, instead of writing something like, students will begin this module by completing X, Y, and Z, write something like, you will begin this module by completing X, Y, and Z. It's a little step, but it can really make a difference. Also talk about yourself in the first person when you're telling something about who you are in that welcome message. Speaking slowly and clearly is another big point when working online, especially with diverse populations who might be learning the language still that you're teaching in. But also in general, even if you have students who are all native speakers, when you have technical issues and people can't hear very well, it's important that you're really enunciating and talking about things clearly, like I'm trying to do right now. Another trick you can do is write about things in the chat box that you usually will have in your online conferencing system that you're using. So for instance, if there's a complicated word or idea, you can actually write it out or have another student write it out to make sure everyone really understands what you're talking about. These little tips and tricks may seem simple or self-explanatory, but they can really make a difference. Dropout rates online tend to be a little higher than normal classes because students just have to click an X or log out of a session. They don't have to face the instructor in person. So it's important to make the little extra effort in establishing these connections. Surprisingly enough, body language, even in an online setting, is really important. As an instructor, you're not only providing academic content to students, but you're also giving a chance to interact directly with other students, foster dialogue, and build a sense of community. Again, this will depend on the context of what you're teaching and for whom, but in general, and especially at Chiron, we really try to foster this participation and interaction and dialogue because our students otherwise don't have a chance to have that in a MOOC. Your body language as the instructor can help set the tone for the entire group. Body language conveys how you're feeling, and students can interpret that behavior as a sign of warmth and friendliness, or notice if you are stressed or anxious, for instance, because of technical difficulties. Be aware of your body language as it may influence how approachable and trustworthy the students find you and how much they engage in group dialogue. So let's list out a couple of those tricks for body language in an online setting. If you're online with an instructor and students and the instructor is leaning back really far and they have their arms folded and you can barely see them on the screen and they're frowning, you are 100% going to have a different experience than if your instructor is leaning forward, if they seem open, if they're smiling. These are some things that can really make a difference in how much your students want to engage. And let's recap some of the ideas overall that we've talked about for how to establish an online presence or identity. Establishing the personal contact early on, before the course and at the beginning of the course via photos, emails, welcome messages, whatever your context allows you. Spoken language in terms of how informal you want to get, using the second person instead of the third person, speaking about yourself in the first person, using clear and concise language. Your body language, how much of the screen you're taking up, if you're smiling, if you seem open and warm or closed off. And another one that's really important is being able to laugh and make fun of yourself. The online environment can be really awkward for the students, but also for the instructor. And it will help the students loosen up and be more okay with that awkwardness if you're doing it. So if something weird happens, acknowledge it. But finally, find out what works for you and makes you the most comfortable, because if you're comfortable, then your students will be too.